She's not in the water. I can tell you that. She wasn't put in the water. I think this scenario was made up to use the water and the boat as a scenario for whatever he did. And I'm not accusing him of doing anything at this point in time, but from my understanding of what I saw from this test, I don't believe she's in the water. I really don't.
The ocean didn't take her. Someone on that boat knows more than they admitted. When investigators boarded the catamaran Soulmate in the Bahamas, they weren't looking at an abandoned vessel drifting at sea. Lynette Hooker's belongings were still there. The boat was still there. But Lynette herself had vanished. At first, the explanation sounded simple. A late-night emergency. Darkness over open water. A tragic accident during a dinghy trip. But almost immediately, investigators began finding details that didn't match the story they were being told. The timeline became difficult to pin down. Statements shifted. Evidence inside the boat raised new questions. And what started as a missing person case quickly turned into something far more complicated. Then came the discoveries investigators couldn't ignore. Signs of possible cleanup. Unexplained injuries. More than 24 inconsistencies. Federal investigators, forensic specialists, and homicide experts all began focusing on the same question. What really happened aboard Soulmate that night? And the deeper the investigation went, the more suspicion turned toward the people closest to Lynette. Tonight on Crimson Archive, we reconstruct the final known timeline, examine the evidence found inside the catamaran, and break down the contradictions surrounding one of the Bahamas' most unsettling disappearance cases. Before Lynette Hooker disappeared, she and her husband Brian were known for a lifestyle that many people only dream about. The couple spent years sailing together aboard their catamaran, Soulmate, documenting life on the water through their online sailing brand, the Sailing Hookers. Their travels took them across coastal waters, marinas, and island destinations, building an image of adventure, freedom, and life away from the mainland. By early 2022, the couple had travelled into the Bahamas, moving between islands aboard Soulmate. At the time, another woman, Kylie Ellsworth, was also travelling with them. The three were sharing the confined environment of the catamaran as they sailed through the region near Elbow Cay and Hopetown. Life aboard a vessel like Soulmate was different from life on land. Space was limited. Privacy was minimal. Every movement, conversation, and decision happened within a relatively small floating environment surrounded by open water. Investigators would later pay close attention to that fact as they worked to reconstruct the final known hours before Lynette vanished. To anyone watching from the outside, the trip appeared routine. The boat remained active around the Bahamas, and nothing publicly suggested the voyage was about to become the centre of an international investigation. But that changed suddenly during the night of February 2022. Within hours, search efforts would begin across the surrounding waters. Authorities would be alerted to a missing woman at sea. And the people left aboard Soulmate would soon find themselves at the centre of growing investigative scrutiny. The trip would end with one person missing and investigators questioning everyone left behind. During the night of February 4, 2022, Soulmate was anchored near Elbow Cay in the Bahamas. According to Brian Hooker's account, the evening began normally before a problem involving the dinghy forced him and Lynette to leave the catamaran late at night. Brian later told investigators that the dinghy had come loose from the boat and was drifting away. He claimed he and Lynette entered the watercraft together in an attempt to secure it before it drifted farther into open water. The conditions outside were dark and the surrounding waters were difficult to navigate at night. According to his version of events, the situation escalated quickly. Brian said Lynette eventually entered the water during the effort to manage the dinghy. He claimed he attempted to search for her but could not locate her in the darkness. At some point afterward, emergency assistance was requested and authorities in the Bahamas were alerted to a possible overboard disappearance. Search efforts began almost immediately. The Royal Bahamas Defence Force, along with other responding agencies, started scanning the surrounding waters near Elbow Cay and Hopetown. Search teams worked through the area looking for any sign of Lynette, focusing on currents, visibility conditions, and possible drift patterns. The operation would continue for days as investigators tried to determine whether the disappearance was the result of a tragic accident at sea or something else entirely. But even in the earlier stages of the case, certain details stood out. No independent witnesses reported seeing Lynette enter the ocean. Investigators also began reviewing the timeline surrounding the dinghy incident itself, including exactly when the emergency occurred, how long the search attempts lasted, and what actions were taken aboard Soulmate before authorities arrived. The story sounded simple, until investigators started checking the details. In the hours after Lynette Hooker was reported missing, search teams focused on the waters surrounding Elbow Cay and Hopetown. The Royal Bahamas Defence Force coordinated efforts across the area, while additional agencies and nearby boaters assisted in scanning possible drift paths near the catamaran's last known location. The search continued through changing weather and difficult visibility conditions. Investigators examined ocean currents, tidal movement, and the possibility that Lynette had been pulled farther away from the area during the night. For days, crews searched the surrounding waters, hoping to locate any sign that could confirm what happened after the reported dinghy incident. But while search operations continued offshore, investigators also began concentrating on the timeline aboard Soulmate itself. As authorities reviewed Brian Hooker's account, questions started emerging almost immediately. Investigators worked to determine the exact sequence of events leading up to Lynette's disappearance, including when the dinghy issue was first discovered, how long the search for Lynette lasted, and when emergency responders were ultimately contacted. Some details appeared difficult to reconcile. The reported timing of certain actions became an early focus of the investigation, along with decisions made during and after the incident. Authorities also began examining the physical condition of the catamaran and the movements of everyone aboard during the critical hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance. At this stage, investigators were still publicly treating the case as a missing person investigation at sea. But internally, the focus had already started shifting, because if Lynette had truly vanished during an accident in open water, investigators expected the surrounding evidence and timeline to support that conclusion clearly. Instead, the case was becoming more complicated with every new detail they reviewed. Attention slowly began turning away from the ocean itself and toward the catamaran where Lynette was last known to be alive. The answers investigators needed might still be inside the boat. As search operations continued in the waters surrounding Elbow Cay, investigators began carrying out a much closer examination of Soulmate itself. What they found aboard the catamaran quickly raised new concerns about the original account of Lynette Hooker's disappearance. The vessel was processed as a potential crime scene. Investigators documented the interior carefully, focusing on areas where activity may have occurred during the critical hours before Lynette was reported missing. Because Soulmate was a relatively confined living space, forensic teams were able to map movements aboard the vessel with greater precision than they might have inside a larger property or open environment. During the examination, authorities identified evidence that prompted additional forensic testing. Public reporting later confirmed that investigators found blood evidence aboard the catamaran. The discovery became one of the most important developments in the case because it shifted attention away from the open water accident theory and back toward the events that may have taken place inside the boat itself. Investigators also examined signs that parts of the vessel may have been cleaned after the reported incident. Those concerns became another major focus of the investigation. Authorities worked to determine when any cleaning occurred, what areas were affected, and whether potential evidence may have been altered before the vessel was fully processed. The layout of Soulmate became increasingly important as investigators reconstructed the timeline. Unlike a large home or public location, movement aboard a catamaran is limited by narrow walkways, sleeping quarters, deck access points, and confined shared spaces. Investigators believed that understanding exactly where people were positioned during key moments could help clarify what happened during the late-night hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance. As forensic analysis continued, the investigation began changing direction. Authorities were no longer focused solely on whether Lynette had accidentally disappeared in rough nighttime conditions. They were now comparing physical evidence aboard the vessel with the statements being provided about the incident itself. That distinction mattered, because if the evidence inside Soulmate failed to align with the reported sequence of events, investigators would need to determine whether the original account was incomplete or intentionally misleading. The evidence inside the catamaran changed the direction of the investigation. As investigators continued analysing evidence aboard Soulmate, one objective became increasingly important: reconstructing the exact timeline of the night Lynette Hooker disappeared. Authorities began reviewing the sequence of events surrounding the dinghy incident minute by minute. According to Brian Hooker's account, the emergency began after the dinghy drifted away from the catamaran during the late-night hours near Elbow Cay. Investigators worked to determine precisely when the problem was first noticed, how long efforts to recover the dinghy lasted, and what movements occurred aboard the vessel before authorities were contacted. Part of that reconstruction involved reviewing navigation and location data connected to Soulmate. Investigators examined available GPS information, anchor positioning, vessel movement, and the surrounding geography near Hopetown and Elbow Cay. Understanding where the catamaran was positioned during the incident became critical because even small discrepancies in timing or movement could affect search calculations and drift estimates in the surrounding waters. Authorities also reviewed communication records connected to the timeline. Investigators examined when emergency contact attempts were made, how events were described during those communications, and whether the reported sequence of events remained consistent over time. As statements and timeline details were compared against physical evidence and digital records, investigators began identifying areas that required further clarification. Some of the emerging questions focused on timing. How long did the search for Lynette continue before authorities were alerted? What movements occurred aboard Soulmate after the incident was reported? And did the available evidence fully align with the version of events investigators had initially been given? As the investigation progressed, the timeline itself became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Because in missing person investigations involving open water, even small gaps in chronology can dramatically change investigative conclusions. Authorities were no longer looking only at where Lynette may have disappeared. They were narrowing in on the critical hours surrounding the incident and examining whether every action taken aboard Soulmate could be fully accounted for. What happened during the hours no one could fully explain. As the search for Lynette Hooker continued in the Bahamas, public attention increasingly turned toward the people who had been aboard Soulmate the night she disappeared. At the centre of that attention was Brian Hooker. In the days following the incident, Brian gave multiple public interviews describing the events surrounding Lynette's disappearance. He maintained that the situation began with the dinghy drifting away from the catamaran during the night, and insisted that the incident had been a tragic accident at sea. But as investigators continued reviewing evidence, portions of the timeline and sequence of events came under increasing scrutiny. Authorities compared statements with physical evidence recovered from Soulmate, communication records, and the broader reconstruction of the night Lynette disappeared. As that process continued, investigators reportedly identified inconsistencies that required further clarification. At the same time, media coverage surrounding the case intensified. The disappearance quickly spread beyond local reporting in the Bahamas and began receiving national attention in the United States. Interviews, televised discussions, and online analysis placed growing focus on Brian's explanations, his movements during the incident, and the evolving details surrounding the timeline aboard Soulmate. Public suspicion also increased as additional information became known about the investigation. Reports that authorities had recovered blood evidence aboard the catamaran raised further questions about whether the physical evidence aligned with the account being publicly presented. Investigators were no longer examining only the possibility of an accidental disappearance in open water. They were now evaluating whether the available evidence suggested a more complicated sequence of events. Behaviour also became part of the public conversation surrounding the case. Online discussions and media commentary closely analysed Brian's interviews, public appearances, and responses to questioning. Investigators, meanwhile, remained focused on evidence, chronology, and factual inconsistencies rather than public opinion. As scrutiny intensified, the contrast at the centre of the investigation became increasingly difficult to ignore. Search teams were still looking for Lynette in the waters surrounding the Bahamas, while investigators were simultaneously rechecking the details of Brian Hooker's story, trying to determine whether the timeline and evidence fully matched the account they had been given. As investigators continued rebuilding the timeline surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance, the case became increasingly centred on inconsistencies they believed required further explanation. Over time, authorities identified what reports later described as more than 24 discrepancies connected to the events aboard Soulmate. The growing list of inconsistencies became one of the most significant developments in the investigation. Some of the questions focused on the timeline itself. Investigators worked to determine exactly when the dinghy problem began, how long the search for Lynette lasted, and what actions were taken before emergency responders were contacted. As statements were reviewed alongside communication records and other evidence, authorities examined whether the reported sequence of events remained fully consistent across interviews and public accounts. Other concerns involved the dinghy incident directly. Investigators reviewed descriptions of how the dinghy drifted away, the movements surrounding the reported recovery attempt, and the conditions during the late-night hours near Elbow Cay. Because there were no publicly confirmed witnesses who saw Lynette enter the water, investigators relied heavily on reconstruction, physical evidence, and timeline analysis to evaluate the account they had been given. The physical evidence aboard Soulmate created additional complications. Public reporting confirmed that investigators recovered blood evidence connected to Lynette inside the catamaran. Authorities also examined concerns surrounding possible cleanup activity aboard the vessel. As forensic findings were compared with statements describing an accidental disappearance at sea, investigators continued examining whether the available evidence fully aligned with the reported version of events. The discrepancies mattered because they affected nearly every stage of the investigation. In missing person cases involving open water, timelines are critical. Small differences in timing can affect search patterns, drift calculations, and the overall reconstruction of events. Investigators needed to determine whether inconsistencies were the result of confusion during a stressful emergency or whether some details of the account remained incomplete. As more questions surfaced, investigative pressure intensified, media coverage expanded, public scrutiny increased, and investigators continued narrowing their focus on the hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance, attempting to separate confirmed facts from conflicting details. One inconsistency could be explained. More than 24 could not be ignored. As public attention surrounding the investigation continued to grow, outside experts and commentators also began examining the circumstances surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance. Among those publicly discussing the case was private investigator T.J. Ward, who questioned whether the available evidence fully supported the explanation of an accidental disappearance at sea. By that stage of the investigation, authorities were already comparing physical evidence, witness accounts, and timeline reconstruction connected to the events aboard Soulmate. Public reporting confirmed that blood evidence connected to Lynette had been recovered from the catamaran. Investigators continued analysing whether those findings aligned with the reported sequence of events surrounding the late-night dinghy incident near Elbow Cay. The structure of the vessel itself also became an important part of the investigative review. Because Soulmate was a confined living environment, investigators closely examined how movement may have occurred aboard the catamaran during the critical hours before Lynette disappeared. Authorities reviewed sleeping areas, deck access points, walkways, and the reported movements connected to the dinghy incident while attempting to reconstruct the timeline as accurately as possible. Public discussion surrounding the case also expanded into analysis of Brian Hooker's media interviews and public statements. Commentators and analysts examined how details surrounding the incident were explained publicly, especially as questions about the timeline and reported sequence of events continued growing. But investigators remained focused primarily on physical evidence, forensic testing, chronology, and corroborated information rather than speculation or public opinion. As additional evidence was reviewed, the investigation increasingly moved away from a straightforward missing person search in open water and toward a broader examination of whether the available facts fully aligned with the original account of the incident. The central issue remained the same. Could the physical evidence, timeline reconstruction, and statements connected to the disappearance all fit together consistently? The deeper experts looked into the evidence, the harder the original story became to defend. As the investigation surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance continued, the case began attracting attention far beyond the Bahamas. National media outlets in the United States started covering the investigation closely, turning the disappearance aboard Soulmate into a widely discussed true crime case. Part of that attention came from the unusual nature of the investigation itself. A woman had vanished during a late-night incident at sea. There were no publicly confirmed witnesses to her entering the water, no confirmed recovery, and mounting questions surrounding the timeline aboard the catamaran. As more details became public, interest in the case grew rapidly across television coverage, online discussions, and true crime communities. The case also drew attention because of comparisons to other high-profile disappearances connected to international travel and unresolved investigations. Among those who publicly commented on the case was Beth Holloway, whose own experience following the disappearance of her daughter, Natalie Holloway, had made her a nationally recognized advocate in missing persons cases involving overseas investigations. Her comments brought additional visibility to the investigation and highlighted the difficulties families often face when disappearances occur outside the United States. As coverage intensified, so did public scrutiny. Media attention increased pressure on investigators to continue clarifying the timeline, processing forensic evidence, and determining whether the known facts of the case supported the original explanation of events aboard Soulmate. At the same time, the growing publicity ensured that the disappearance of Lynette Hooker would remain in the public eye as investigators continued searching for answers. As the investigation into Lynette Hooker's disappearance continued expanding, authorities took a major step that signaled how seriously the case was now being treated. Soulmate, the catamaran where Lynette was last known to be alive, was formally seized as part of the investigation. The action involved the Coast Guard Investigative Service, along with other agencies working the case. By that point, investigators had already spent weeks examining evidence connected to the vessel, reviewing the timeline, and comparing statements with forensic findings recovered aboard the catamaran. The seizure marked a clear turning point. Authorities were no longer approaching Soulmate simply as the last known location connected to a missing person at sea. The vessel itself had become a central focus of the investigation and a critical source of physical evidence. After the seizure, investigators continued processing areas of the catamaran in greater detail. The confined structure of the boat allowed authorities to examine movements, access points, and evidence locations within a relatively controlled environment. Investigators worked to preserve and analyse anything that could help clarify what occurred during the late-night hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance. Federal-level involvement also increased public attention surrounding the case. For many observers, the seizure of Soulmate suggested that investigators believed the available evidence required a far more extensive review than would normally occur in a straightforward overboard accident investigation. Media coverage intensified as images and reporting surrounding the catamaran circulated publicly. At the same time, investigators remained careful about what information they released. Authorities did not publicly disclose every detail connected to the forensic findings or timeline analysis. But the decision to seize and process the vessel at that level made one thing increasingly clear. The investigation had moved far beyond the initial explanation of a tragic nighttime accident at sea. Attention was now centred on reconstructing exactly what happened aboard Soulmate and determining whether the physical evidence, timeline and statements connected to the disappearance could ultimately be reconciled. The investigation was no longer centred on the ocean, it was centred on the boat. As investigators continued examining the events surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance, attention also remained on the other person aboard Soulmate during the trip, Carly Ellsworth. Carly had been travelling with Lynette and Brian Hooker aboard the catamaran during their time in the Bahamas. Because the vessel was a confined living space and the timeline surrounding the disappearance remained under intense scrutiny, investigators examined the movements and accounts of everyone connected to the events aboard Soulmate. Public attention surrounding Carly increased as media coverage expanded. Online discussions and true crime forums frequently questioned what she may have witnessed, what she may have known about the events surrounding the disappearance, and how closely her account aligned with the broader timeline investigators were attempting to reconstruct. At the same time, much of the public speculation moved far beyond the information that had actually been confirmed publicly. Investigators remained focused on corroborated evidence, timeline reconstruction, and documented statements rather than online theories. Public reporting indicated that authorities continued gathering information connected to the case, but many investigative details involving interviews and cooperation were never fully released publicly. That uncertainty left major questions unanswered. Because the investigation had already established that the critical events surrounding Lynette's disappearance occurred within a relatively small and controlled environment aboard Soulmate. Investigators were working to determine how movements aboard the vessel aligned with the available evidence and whether every part of the timeline could be independently verified. But despite the growing scrutiny surrounding everyone connected to the case, many details remained unknown to the public. Authorities continued withholding significant portions of the investigative record, while forensic analysis and timeline reconstruction remained ongoing. And as the investigation moved forward, one question continued to follow the case. What did everyone aboard truly know that night? Years after Lynette Hooker disappeared in the waters near Elbow Cay, the investigation surrounding Soulmate still remains publicly unresolved in several key areas. Authorities examined physical evidence recovered from the catamaran, reconstructed portions of the timeline, reviewed witness accounts, and analysed the reported sequence of events surrounding the late-night dinghy incident. But despite the extensive investigative attention given to the case, many findings and forensic details have never been fully released publicly. That lack of complete public disclosure has left significant questions unanswered. Investigators spent considerable time attempting to determine whether the available evidence aboard Soulmate fully aligned with the explanation initially provided about Lynette's disappearance. Timeline gaps, inconsistencies in reported events, and unanswered forensic questions continued drawing attention as the investigation progressed. At the centre of the case remained a difficult reality common in maritime investigations. Unlike crimes that occur on land, incidents at sea often involve limited witnesses, environmental challenges, changing water conditions, and the possibility of evidence being permanently lost. Search areas can expand rapidly, timelines become harder to reconstruct, and investigators must often rely heavily on forensic interpretation and circumstantial evidence. The disappearance of Lynette Hooker became a case shaped as much by unanswered questions as by confirmed facts. What exactly happened during the final critical hours aboard Soulmate? Did the physical evidence fully support the reported account of an accident at sea? And are there details investigators know that have never been disclosed publicly? Those questions continue to follow the case, because despite years of scrutiny, media attention, and forensic review, the full sequence of events surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance has never been publicly resolved with complete certainty. What do you believe happened aboard Soulmate? The disappearance of Lynette Hooker remains one of the most closely examined maritime missing person cases in recent years, because so many parts of the investigation continue to exist between confirmed evidence and unanswered questions. Investigators reconstructed timelines, reviewed communication records, analysed forensic findings aboard Soulmate, and examined inconsistencies connected to the reported sequence of events during the night Lynette disappeared near Elbow Cay. Over time, the investigation shifted steadily away from a simple accident narrative and toward a far more complex examination of what may have occurred aboard the catamaran itself. The physical evidence became impossible to ignore. Blood evidence recovered from Soulmate, concerns surrounding the timeline, and questions connected to the late-night dinghy incident all contributed to the growing scrutiny surrounding the case. Authorities spent years comparing statements, forensic findings, and reconstructed movements aboard the vessel while attempting to determine whether every detail aligned consistently. And yet, despite the extensive investigation, critical uncertainties still remain. No complete public reconstruction of the final events has ever been released. Many investigative details remain undisclosed, and the full truth surrounding what happened aboard Soulmate that night has never been publicly resolved with certainty. At the centre of all of it is Lynette Hooker, a woman who disappeared during a voyage that was supposed to reflect freedom and adventure, instead became the focus of an international mystery filled with unanswered questions, conflicting accounts, and years of investigation. If you followed this investigation from beginning to end, let us know your thoughts below. What do you believe happened aboard Soulmate during the final hours before Lynette Hooker disappeared? At Crimson Archive, we focus on evidence-based true crime documentaries built around verified reporting, forensic analysis, investigative timelines, and unresolved mysteries that continue raising questions years later. Subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated on future investigations, developing cases, and deep dive breakdowns designed for viewers who want facts, context, and careful analysis, not sensationalism. And as always, thank you for watching Crimson Archive.